Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight's discussion is one I've personally been looking forward to for a long time because it sits right at the crossroads of science, philosophy, spirituality, and the deepest human questions we all eventually confront, whether we admit it openly or not. What is consciousness? What happens when the brain begins shutting down? Are near death experiences simply neurological events created by a stressed brain, or are they glimpses into something beyond our current understanding of reality? These are questions that humanity has wrestled with for thousands of years in religion, mythology, philosophy, and now increasingly in neuroscience itself. Our guest tonight is uniquely qualified to guide us through this conversation. Dr. Vivek Palavali is a brain surgeon with more than 30 years of experience operating on the human brain, the very organ responsible for perception, memory, identity, emotion, and consciousness itself. But what makes Dr. Vivek particularly fascinating is that he refuses to stay trapped inside intellectual silos. He approaches these questions not as a preacher trying to prove doctrine, nor as a cynic trying to dismiss human experience, but as a surgeon, thinker, filmmaker, and a scientific humanist willing to confront uncomfortable mysteries and with honesty. He is the author of several books, including A Mindful Life and Bitter Pill, America and Healthcare in America, and his award winning documentaries have explored the neuroscience of mysticism, religiosity, and healthcare inequality. His newest book, Searching for Soul, a brain surgeon's exploration of near-death experiences and afterlife, takes readers on an extraordinary journey through documented cases of out of body experiences, near death experiences. We've all heard these stories, ancient religious accounts, neuroscience, philosophy, and the eternal debate surrounding the possibility of the soul and the afterlife. What I found particularly compelling about his book is that it does not insult the intelligence of either believers or skeptics. Instead, it forces all of us to confront a difficult possibility that human consciousness may still be far less understood than modern society likes to pretend. And frankly, in an age where people speak with absolute certainty about everything after reading half a tweet and watching a 40-second TikTok clip, intellectual humility may be the most revolutionary thing left. Tonight's conversation is not about telling people what to believe. It's about asking better questions, questions about death, questions about meaning, questions about consciousness, questions about whether human beings are merely biological machines or something more profound. So, wherever you stand philosophically or spiritually, I invite you to approach tonight's discussion with curiosity, openness, and courage, because the biggest questions in life rarely come with comfortable answers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Vivek. Dr. Vivek, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Wissam. I really appreciate the opportunity to have a good discussion. I enjoyed the forum, so I appreciate you inviting me to have this discussion.
Thank you. The first question, doctors, I want you first to tell us a little bit about the journey of writing this book. You have, a neurosurgeon is, a brain surgeon is one of probably the busiest and most stressed jobs in this world, and yet you always have found time to manage to produce a way to carry on this knowledge to the public, whether through filmmaking, whether through books, your speaking opportunities. I've met you in several of these. So tell us about this, the latest in your journey.
Okay. Well, the first thing is people ask me, they do ask me, how do you have time? And I say, I don't play golf. Apparently, as a doctor, you're supposed to play golf. I don't play golf, so I have a lot of time. But more importantly, it's the passion. It's the passion that I have to explore the neuroscience behind possibly the religious, mystical, and spiritual experiences that humans have. I've always been interested in that. And that's why I made some films called Creator of God, a brain surgeon story. And I used to give some presentations to American Humanist Society about the neuroscience of mysticism. So I was always interested in that. But what happened was a few years ago, a patient was sent to me. She was in her 70s, a very nice lady. Her name is Patricia. She was having visions of Satan and monsters every 20 minutes, making her scream. And this was incessant. So her daughter said, Mom, there's something wrong with you. We got to go to the doctor. So she took her to the doctor, and the doctor realized she was having seizures. So they put her on medication. Her visions decreased, but they didn't go away. So they did a brain CAT scan that showed she had a tumor on the left side near what's called the temporal lobe, where our memories, called the hippocampus, which holds our memories, is located at. And I did surgery on her and removed the tumor, and her visions went away. And I was seeing her 2 weeks after surgery, make sure everything is fine. She was doing fine, but she said, by the way, Dr. Palavali, I had an out-of-body experience during surgery. I said, wait a minute. I really am very interested in that. Would you mind if I document and have an interview and make a documentary about it, because I'm fascinated by this topic? She said, absolutely no problem. But by the way, 20 years ago, I was involved in a motorhome fire accident, and I had carbon monoxide poisoning, and I had a near-death experience where I saw Jesus, and I had my soul go to heaven and come back. So I was even more fascinated. So I said, listen, I really would like to make this documentary. So in the process, I interviewed some other people who had near-death and out-of-body experiences. And then I traveled to Netherlands, England, France, and Belgium to interview some of the experts who are in this field. And I also did my own research, starting from ancient religions to current major religions, and the evolution of the concept of soul from very early Greek philosophy that eventually took me to neuroscience. And in 21st century, we have a lot of information that we did not have few decades or few centuries ago that we now have. And I think we are on the verge of getting a lot of answers to the components of near-death experience, especially this concept of soul leaving our body and looking at themselves, or journeying into supernatural realms and seeing their ancestors that are deceased, or divine entities.
So Patricia's experience during this brain surgery, doctor, raises a fascinating issue. If the brain can create experiences that feel spiritually more real than reality, what does that tell us about human consciousness itself? That's one of the recurring themes in the near-death experiences across cultures, is the sensation of leaving the body and it feels real. So all these descriptions of feelings that feel real, how does our consciousness then distinguish truth from non-truth?
Okay, so as you said, when patients have this out-of-body experience, they feel like their soul left the body and is outside of what's called extrapersonal space, that is outside of your physical body. And the reason that happens is we have to understand a little bit of the neuro anatomy and physiology that explains how this happens. So normally, like right now, you and me, we have our own, what we call as a body schema, or an image of ourselves in this part of the brain called temporoparietal junction, which is on the right side, where the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe joins, called temporoparietal junction. What happens is that that's the area where all our sensations from all our sensory organs, like vision, hearing, sensation of touch, joint movements called proprioception, and equilibrium, which is positional sense in three-dimensional space, they all come together and smoothly create what's called a body schema. And this is located next to parietal lobe, which deals with three-dimensional spatial orientation. So normally what happens is that this body schema and the three-dimensional spatial orientation are integrated harmoniously, and we don't even think about it, and we just move around, and we feel like our body is moving in a three-dimensional space without a problem. But whenever there is disruption of this harmonious integration, they feel like their body schema is outside of the three-dimensional space in what's called an extrapersonal space. And that happens in patients who have near-death experience, like, for example, cardiac arrest, drowning, seizures, extreme trauma, extreme fear, drugs like some other medications, or people who have seizures. So there is disruption of this. So they feel like they're outside. But unless there is the disruption, we feel like what we're experiencing is real. But the experience that people have when they have near-death experience, some of the, what we call as monitoring parts of the brain. So for example, we have what's called dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that tells us what's real, what's not real. For example, think about a dream, okay? When you have a very vivid dream in what's called REM sleep, this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is turned off. So the brain thinks it's real until they wake up and say, oh my goodness, that was just a dream. But there's a condition called lucid dream, in which case this part of the brain is partially active. So the people who are having the lucid dream recognize that they're dreaming and they can still control. So it all depends on which part of the brain is active and monitoring to tell us truth versus not truth, a dream versus reality.
So, Doctor, why do you think that this phenomena appears so universally throughout human history, yet we have, we don't find enough neurosurgeons or scientists actually facing this and correcting the views or explaining the views of this phenomena? Is this phenomena just is stronger than the public perception of science about it?
Yes. So what happens is that people, so the experiences are real. So let me go back a little bit. So one of the first documented historical story about what I think is a near-death experience, but was considered as an afterlife experience, was called The Myth of Error in Plato's book. And what happened was there was this soldier who was in a battle, and everybody thought he died, but they noticed that his body was, unlike all the other dead bodies that were cold, his body was still warm. But they didn't know the difference between coma versus death, so they were going to just cremate him, and so they put him on funeral pyre. And a couple of days later, when they put him on funeral pyre, he woke up and he said, I had this vision and journey into afterlife, and I saw the souls being judged, being sent above to heaven and below to hell. So that story is called Myth of Error. That's one of the very first documented one. But there were many, many experiences, but people were scared to bring them up because a lot of, unfortunately, medical professionals kind of wrote them off as hallucinations or people were crazy. Until 1975, Dr. Raymond Moody gathered 100 experiences who had this near-death experience and out-of-body experiences. And he wrote a book called Life After Life. And that book became very famous. And that, I think, we should give credit to him, brought this near-death experience into the discourse of the main society. But since then, there were other doctors who talked about it. But neuroscience also is more interested. Now, when you asked me, how come the neurosurgeons are not interested? So there are a lot of people who are in neuroscience field, but do they have this special interest to look at this and try to explain it from a natural neurobiology phenomena versus if they already have for example, a spiritual or a religious belief, they're not going to question that. They're going to interpret that experience from that angle. Whereas I am more interested in really, is there a natural explanation that can explain all the components of this near-death experience? For example, some of the most common things people see is what's called a tunnel of light, bright tunnel of light, visions of deceased people, and also what they call as beings of light, and then out of body experience and journeys into divine realms. So we now have a lot of information in neuroscience that explains it. But people who have this experience, if they're not interested in knowing, hey, let me find out if there's a natural explanation, if they already have a certain religious bias or faith that gives them solace and comfort to believe in heaven and afterlife that's eternal, they're going to go in that direction. But those who are curious or want to know the truth may want to really explore the neuroscience explanation for all these phenomena. Now, as far as the universality of it, the reason, no matter what part of the globe, these common elements occur because our brains are the same no matter what part of the world we are. Now, that brings us to what we call as the peopling of the earth. As you know, right now, we do have some information that says that every human that's walking on the face of the earth came from a single group of Africans, because the way they know that is that we have two kinds of DNA, the DNA that's in the nucleus of a cell, and then the DNA that's in what's called mitochondria. And the DNA in the mitochondria comes from only a mother. And every human that's walking on the face of the earth, their mitochondrial DNA is identical, which tells everybody that all these people came from Africa and then people the rest of the earth. And because of that, our brains are similar, you know. And when I operate on the brain, I have operated on Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, male, female, straight, and gay. And when I open the skull, I can't tell any difference. And we give only one kind of morphine because our brains are from a single source of human ancestry. And that's why these experiences are also universal and they have common elements. But the only difference is when they see the so-called divine realms or angels or gods, those depend upon the faith or the religion into which they're born or brought up on the practice. So, for example, in India, so this lady is a very ardent Christian. So because of that, her hippocampus has images of Jesus and Satan and all those things. That's why she saw them. Whereas in India, the reports that we have is that the ruler of hell is called Yamaraj. And when somebody dies, Yamaraj sends his messengers called Yamaduts to bring the soul. And in Hindu hell, there is the assistant of Yamaraj called Chitragupta, who has a book that has, it's called the Book of Sins and Virtues. So if your soul and if your life on earth was practiced in such a way that your name falls on the virtuous column, you go to heaven. But if it fell on the sins column, you go to hell. But sometimes they say, well, we got the wrong soul. Or sometimes they say, it's not your time, so they send the soul back. So this is a belief in Hinduism. So that's the only difference. Other than that, rest of the brain mechanisms that cause this what's called tunnel of light, bright light, and hazy figures on out-of-body experience, they're all universally similar.
So in the book, Doctor, you discuss how fear, trauma, oxygen deprivation, anesthesia, and extreme stress can alter consciousness. Do you believe neuroscience alone will eventually explain all near-death experiences, or do some cases still resist material explanation?
So knowing what we know now, I must say that we are very close to explaining all components of near-death experience. Now, when you bring the word consciousness, that's a little bit different. Consciousness, as you know, first of all, we have to define what consciousness, and I define consciousness as awake and aware and interacting with external environment as well as internal environment. That, what I mean by that is the thoughts and our emotions or desires, okay? So we now have a lot of information that tells us that brain is the organ that's responsible for consciousness. And people always wonder, well, what happens after death? And there are some famous cardiologists and neurosurgeons and orthopedic surgeons and psychologists that are proposing that the consciousness is outside and brain is just an antenna through which the consciousness is sent into the body to do the things that our body does, whether it is emotions or desires or thoughts. But the problem with that is that we have a hard time to confirm that. And the reason I say that is that as a neurosurgeon, I know that when there is an insult to the brain, whether it is trauma or their metabolic deficiencies or infections. For example, the famous book written by a neurosurgeon called Eben Alexander called Proof of Heaven, he had very severe E. coli meningitis, which is infection of the covering of the brain that can also affect the brain. And he was in coma. I don't think he was dead, but he wrote a book saying that his experience was an afterlife experience. But when the patients are unconscious, we don't automatically assume that they are dead. You have to have very specific study to see if the patient has brain death or not. For example, we have to do 3 ways we can find out if the brain death has occurred or not. One is to do what's called electroencephalogram that records the activity at the top of the brain, and you have to have a flat line, no electrical waves. But that's not enough because the deep part of the brain called brain stem is still active. And the way we know if it's gone or not is to send auditory impulses through the ear called brainstem auditory evoked responses. And that lets us know if the brainstem is working or not. So even that has to be flat. So you have to have both EEG and BAERs flat before we say the patient is brain dead. But until you do that, let's say that the patient was comatose and came back, we don't call them the patient was dead for a few minutes and came back. We say the patient was comatose and came back. And same thing with cardiac arrest. Unfortunately, when you have a flat line on EKG and the patient is unresponsive and looks like apparently he's dead or she's dead, but you're able to either do CPR by doing chest compressions or put adrenaline right in the heart or shock with defibrillator, and the patient comes back, we don't ever say the word patient was dead for a few minutes. We say he was in cardiac arrest for a few minutes and patient, he was able to be reversed. Unfortunately, what happens is that a lot of the medical professional use this word, what's called clinical death, loosely. And I have a problem using that expression, clinical death, because the moment you use the word death, death is actually defined as permanent and irreversible cessation of biological activity that sustains the life of an organism. So you have to have permanent and irreversible cessation of this. Only then you have to use the word death. Until that time, don't use the word clinical death. If the patient is comatose, came back, say he was comatose. Patient has cardiac arrest and came back, say he was in cardiac arrest. Don't use the word death because patients, they say, well, my doctor told me I was dead for 3-5 minutes and I came back. So they take it very seriously, and it's hard for them to get out of that state of mind that they were truly dead and came back. So for that reason, I think you should really be careful. But I believe we are now really on the verge of talking about consciousness. But consciousness is a little bit more difficult to define unless, as you say, we have a universal agreement what consciousness is and how we are going to investigate that and how we confirm that brain is the organ that's creating consciousness.
Okay, so let me put the question in a different way, Doctor. Have you seen any case from your research or personal experience of a near-death experience that is not explainable by neuroscience?
I would say not so far, because there is recently a paper came. Let me go back. We are able to not only explain near-death experiences in conditions we talked about, like cardiac arrest, drowning, and all those things. We now have the ability in some cases where, by stimulating the what's called the temporoparietal junction, people say that they felt like they're outside of their body, or parts of their. So the very first time that was recorded was in 1950s by a neurosurgeon called Wilder Penfield, who was famous for doing seizure surgery in Montreal. And he was stimulating a woman to see where the seizure was starting. And she said, I feel like I'm outside of my body. That was the very first, what's called a direct brain stimulation that caused this so-called out-of-body experience. Now, you can do that, and the patient is awake at that time, called awake brain surgery, because you want to make sure that you're not going to damage what's called the motor cortex that deals with movement of our arm and leg, or speech area that allows us to speak. So you don't want to damage them. So the patient is awake. So once you anesthetize the scalp and the bone, and then once you open, the brain doesn't feel any pain, because brain itself does not have pain receptors. So you can stimulate it and they won't feel pain. So this is done not uncommonly for what's called seizure surgery. So that was the very first one. Then there are other similar surgeries, but the paper that recently came that had 6 patients who had this stimulation of temporoparietal junction was done by a neurologist who specializes in seizure research from Geneva, called, his name is Olaf Blank. And he said the same thing, that we now are very close to confirm that this out-of-body experience happens because there is a disruption of this body schema and the 3-dimensional spatial orientation that can happen from whatever the cause may be, like cardiac arrest. So for that reason, I believe we are on the verge of explaining everything through neuroscience.
Right. So many people who experience near-death events report permanent personality changes afterward, becoming less materialistic, more compassionate, less afraid of death, more religious. As a physician, how do you interpret that transformation?
Okay. So yeah, you're right. So this is a very profound and transforming experience in people. Some people may not have that profound experience, and some people actually have a terrifying experience, but a lot of them say they had a very profound transforming experience. In fact, it makes them feel like they lose fear of death, because some of them, they say that we have been to this supernatural realm, so we know what awaits us after death. But the most important explanation, I believe, is this. What happens is that when you have near-death experience, there is only one case in human history where there was a complete 20-lead EEG recorded in a man who was dying. So there is a lot of recording of partial recordings, but this was the only one. And there's a neurosurgeon by name Azmal Zamar in the University of Louisville, who is one of the authors of the paper. So I interviewed him. So what it showed was, it showed during that time of just before complete death, cessation of all activity, they had what's called gamma activation. That means the EEG wave showed gamma activation, which is the frequency is greater than 30. So that happens in people who have transcendental meditation. So for example, people who are meditating and they feel like they lost limits of their physical body, and they feel like they're one with the universe, and they feel like this is their real self that has no boundaries, and we are now part of this universe. That happens in some of these people. They feel like what's called death of ego. They don't feel like this is it. I'm not just my person, but I'm part of the whole universe. And because of that, I now recognize that there's no difference between the other human beings and me, and they feel like they have to treat other beings with more compassionate and kind attitude. And again, as I said, there are actually research. There's actually research done by actually another doctor by name Andrew Newberg, who was a neuroradiologist. He wrote a book called Why God Won't Go Away. And he specifically studied people who did transcendental meditation. And in those people, what happens is that transcendental meditation is nothing but real focused attention. You're really, really focusing on one thing, whether it is breath or a candle or a thought or something. But what happens is that the front part of the brain becomes very active, called prefrontal cortex, which is called the executive function area. But the parietal cortex slows down. That's the area that deals with our three-dimensional spatial orientation. So they lose that boundaries and they feel like I'm now united with the universe. So these experiences can happen during near-death experience. So they feel like they had this loss of their sense of self. And also by meditating on a regular basis, the center for what we call as compassion, called anterior cingulate gyrus, it becomes more prominent. And the part of the brain called amygdala that deals with fear, anger, becomes a little smaller. So these people become more compassionate. So these profound experiences can change the brain in such a way that it's similar to people who do transcendental meditation.
Interesting. Doctor, you describe yourself as a secular, as a scientific humanist. Has researching these experiences made you question any of your own personal beliefs about death, the soul, or the possibility of an afterlife, or actually it has always went along or confirmed your ideology or your belief as a humanist?
So until I started doing this research and doing the book, I did have some questions about the concept of soul and out-of-body experience, where they feel like their soul left the body. I did not have an answer for that. I had answers for the other ones, but I did not have an answer for this. But I think by doing this research and specifically looking at what's called awake brain surgery, where they stimulated this, and the papers written by Olaf Blank, I am more inclined to say that soul is a concept that was created at a time when they did not understand how a brain worked, or what's called the animating principle of life. So think about it. So imagine a caveman, okay? The caveman probably saw one of his ancestors or family members die and questioned, okay, what happened to this person that was moving and, interacting and hunting, and suddenly that person is motionless and there's no breath and they have to just bury, and they didn't know what was causing that. So this is what they call as animating principle. So they use the word spirit or anima for that gave life to that body, but they still didn't know what was causing motion, emotions, reasoning, and all that. They gave this concept called soul because they still did not know what was causing it. So now we know that brain causes a lot of these emotions and responsible for our movements and our thoughts. So this concept of soul evolved from very early stages, explained as spirit, or a non-physical, immaterial, invisible, eternal entity that, for example, Plato and some of the Indian Hindu mystics believed exists in a supernatural world, but enters our body when we're born, only to be perceived as being shackled in a physical body and can't wait to get out of that and go back to this supernatural realm to be reborn again. And this reincarnation was believed by Plato and also very common in India still. But those that philosophy, that idea of Plato, who called soul what's called a tripartite soul, which means it had three components. It has reason, called logos, which was in the head, and thumos are emotions, which are in the chest, and then eros are desires, which are in the stomach. And he, in fact, said that the logos doesn't want to be corrupted by emotions and desires. So the neck was separating that to prevent it from being corrupted. But his own favorite student, Aristotle, didn't quite believe in it. He said, soul is nothing but a form of a body, physical body called matter. It's called the form of the matter that forms the body. And once that matter dissolves, disintegrates, there's no soul. So there was actually completely opposite idea of these two famous philosophers. And that idea of soul was there till almost 17th century, when Descartes started thinking about the concept of mind. So he equated soul with mind, and he didn't quite use the word soul much. He used the word mind-body dualism, and mind to him was was a thinking substance, but not a physical substance like the body. The physical body was a mechanical properties, like an automaton. The body is a mechanical automaton. It's the thinking substance that he thought was located in the pineal gland that made the body work, and only that survived death. But later, there was another famous neurologist by name Thomas Willis. He is considered to be the father of neurology. He was doing dissections of the brains of people who were hanged in Oxford in England to see where soul was. And he was the first one to attribute different functions of the body to different parts of the brain. Like, for example, movement to cerebellum, and respiration and breathing to brainstem. And the top surface, he thought, was where reason was. But his own contemporary and also a person who listened to his lectures, John Locke, who is responsible for what's called the representative philosophy of representative democratic philosophy, he took that word soul and said it's consciousness, that what we call a soul is nothing but consciousness. So that's when, in 17th century, the word soul stopped from being part of neuroanatomy and neurophysiology textbooks. Now, so the one thing I want to just bring in my own personal experience of, you asked me what happened. So my father was my living hero when he was alive. He passed away 2 years ago. And my mother is still very religious. So I have a 2-year older brother. And in India, it's the older brother's responsibility, older son's responsibility to carry the rituals after death of the parent, okay? So my father was cremated, and the ashes part of the ashes were taken, and they go to a sacred river and they say a prayer and release some of them. But I told him, I want some of his ashes sent to me. So my brother sent a small box of my dad's ashes. They're actually sitting right next to the busts of Galileo, Charles Darwin, Epicurus, who is my favorite philosopher, and as I said, and Aristotle. So it's right next to them. The reason I bring that up is that Epicurus is, as I said, one of my favorite philosophers. He was in around 190 BCE in Greece, and he was a follower of Democritus, who came up with the word atom. So think about it. 2,300 years ago, Democritus said everything is made of atoms. I mean, it's mind-boggling that they were thinking about this. So Epicurus said, even human bodies are made of atoms. So he said, when particularly fine atoms come together and work harmoniously, life exists. When they disrupt, death exists. So when death happens, there's no entity that is still intact that goes to hell. To him, bad things happen. So the goal and meaning of life has to be pursuit of happiness in this one and only life. And when he brought this up, he was considered heretic and blasphemous. So he had to be careful about his life. But he started thinking, at that time, slaves and women were considered to be the property of men. He said, no, no, no. Even slaves and women are made of atoms, so they're like men. So we are all equal. So he was a very liberal man for his time, and he was non-religious. And because he said this is the only life, you must enjoy every day to the life to the best you can, but in moderation. So when I see the ashes of my father, I wonder, okay, well, if there was a soul, is part of the soul with me on my table next to this. So for all these reasons, I am more in favor of that. When I die, I will be. So think about it. When we're born, we from the union of a sperm and an egg, and that forms the zygote, which is a single tiny cell we can't see with the eye. You got to use a microscope. Then the energy and the food and oxygen in the form of food that was ingested and water and fluids that were imbibed by the mother makes us grow. And when we come out, we eat the tree, the fruit, the leaves, the meat, and then we grow. And when we die, we become the constituent energies of the universe from which we came. And a lot of times it's difficult for a lot of people to accept it, but this gives me a very healthy sense of urgency to live my life every day to the best I can.
Interesting. So your scientific understanding, just like it puts your birth in perspective, it puts also your death in perspective, and you don't find anything contradictory there. Modern society, often frames science and spirituality as enemies, and that's a problem. Do you think that conflict is real, or is it just partly the result of people misunderstanding science, or sometimes misunderstanding spirituality, or misunderstanding both of them?
Yeah, so I never look at religion as enemy. I don't, because when I was young, I used to have really heated discussions or arguments. I don't have them anymore because I understand why people believe a certain way. And that's because for many of them, life is hard. So they are looking for something that hopefully in afterlife or a next reincarnation will have better joy and peace and happiness. That's one reason. The second reason is that humans are the only animals that are exquisitely aware of their own mortality. What I mean by that is that our closest DNA cousin is chimpanzee, which is 99% identical DNA. And chimpanzee apparently looks only 7 days into future. I don't know how they got that information or observation, but that's apparently what they can do. But all the other animals, like say, for example, a deer that's being chased by a lion, the deer runs around, and if it escapes the predator, it doesn't sit there and say, why me? What's the meaning of life? Why am I being chased? It just looks around and says, where's the grass and where's the water? But humans are the only animals that are capable of looking billions of years into the past and billions of years into the future. So we have now kind of have some evidence that Big Bang happened around 13.5 billion years ago because of what's called cosmic background explorer. And the Earth formed around 4.55 billion years ago, and life came later. And the modern humans came, not the Homo erectus, but what's called modern humans, maybe around 300,000 years ago. But we are the only animal that can think about and say, wait a minute, in 100 years, I could die, So that's a very unpleasant thought to accept. So for that reason, if people get solace because they believe in this idea of eternal life that's full of joy and happiness next to their deity they believe in, and gives them comfort, and get over this existential angst of awareness of their own mortality, that's okay. And that happens because in our brain, we have what's called the rational part of the brain, and then the deeper part of the brain called limbic system. And when there is conflict between these two, generally it's the limbic system that wins. So people want to be secure and peaceful and happy. So this idea of eternal afterlife gives them hope, solace, and comfort. So when they have that, no problem, you can do that. But religion sometimes can be dogmatic. Science also, you don't want to push somebody and say, oh, this is it. You say, well, this is what we think is happening based on our observation using scientific method. And this is the information. You can take it if you're interested in truth and want to follow it, that's fine. But even if you heard this and you still want to believe because this belief in afterlife gives you some solace, that's okay. But the problem comes when one religion says their dogmatic doctrine is the only one that's correct and has conflict with the other, because this belief spills out of their personal sphere and there are religious conflicts. That's where I have a problem. Otherwise, I don't look at religion as an enemy. I understand why people believe in certain things, but my interest is, can we explain this phenomena through natural science that is rooted in neurobiology of our brains? And as you know, that throughout this 2 millennia and centuries, we have amassed so much knowledge that explains so many different things.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. And I don't want to go in a tangent talking about what constitutes death, and also I don't want to also take a tangent talking about consciousness, although this subject kind of is sandwiched in between these two concepts. But we want to focus on the near-death experiences. So.
Yeah.
And we're due to the time of the program. I'm going to ask the final question, which is, after studying these experiences for years, Doctor, and now sharing this research with us through your book, and after listening to so many personal testimonies, what do you believe humanity still fundamentally misunderstands about death? And you wish for them to understand, because sometimes you're dealing with patients and you cannot really educate them based on their you don't want to challenge their faith or their preconceived concepts as a physician. But here you are an educator. What do you feel that we still misunderstand about death, and how science can actually help us through this very difficult spiritual experience?
Yeah, so death, as we just talked a little bit, is a very unpleasant thought to think about. It's I mean, I remember when I was 15 years old, suddenly one day, this thought of death came into my mind, and I could not escape it, because you can't escape your own thoughts. So unless I was distracted by a friend or some kind of activity, it was just bothering me. And until I read a book by Jock London, a story in a book called To Build a Fire, that talked about the life of Eskimos. And what they do is that they're nomadic. So they're in one area. When the food, like seals and other ones, they can't catch anymore, they move on. And when they move on, they leave everything that they don't think is useful. And unfortunately, the older people that lost their sight or ability to move, they have to leave them and go. So this is the story of one man who's leaving his father and remembering his grandfather being done. And the father was blind, but the son was nice enough to leave a little bit of food for him. All the food is precious. And this blind man is thinking about what he did to his father, and he feels something wet on his hand, and he realizes it was a wolf, and he tries to shoo it away. Then a few minutes later, it comes back, he shoos it away. A few minutes later, more come in. Then he realizes, wait a minute, I'm not going to fight this. The law of life is death. Nobody can escape death. So he accepts it and doesn't do anything. So, as unpleasant as it is, if you want to know about it, you have to think about it and you have to learn about it. What constitutes life? What constitutes death? And if you're curious and ability to accept it, because there are some people who they're actually what's called uh, 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 the death cafes, people who have cancer who know they're going to die, they want to accept it. And I recently just bought a book, I've not read it yet, that said how to face the fear of death. So if you really want to understand death, you have to think about it and you have to accept it as the finality and see if you want to go towards the science to understand it, or do you want to go towards religion to get some solace or answers? And whatever your core emotions accept, you have to go and accept it. But there's no reason to fight about it. You just have to figure out what kind of person you are and what you are seeking. And are you seeking truth? Are you seeking truth that may be unpleasant? Or are you seeking a belief that gives you comfort? That's going to be your choice.
Thank you, Doctor, and thank you for all those who participated. We have a few comments and questions. I will not have time to go over all of them, but one of them is, for example, the true essence is the eternal soul, Atman. Self-realization is recognizing that your soul is identical to the universal divine consciousness, Brahman. This feels like it comes from Hindu anthology. Do you have any comments about this, Doctor?
Absolutely. I discussed a lot about that in my book, actually, called Atman and Brahman. So this comes from the part of the Hindu scriptures called Upanishads. So Upanishads are philosophical discourses, and what happened was, even though there are a lot of gods in Hinduism, these Upanishads were a little bit before the so-called anthropomorphic gods, like gods that look like humans, were created. So Upanishads were around 1500 BCE to around 500 BCE. So it predates the so-called anthropomorphic gods. And in that Upanishads, there were probably people who were thinking, okay, well, what is this universe and how is everything is connected? So, for example, the rain comes, the seed becomes a tree and has fruits. The animal eats the fruits, or the human eats the fruits, and then over a period of time, they die and they become part of the earth, only to be taken up by maybe another tree that was there. Like, for example, some of the ashes, my father-in-law's ashes are in the ground under a tree, and I'm sure part of his ashes are part of that tree. So they realized the interconnectedness of all these energies, and this overall energy is the one they call Brahman, and a temporary representation of that Brahman is what they call as Atman. So, for example, the soul in me is a temporary representation of that Brahman until I die. And when I die, that becomes part of the Brahman. So it's a concept of universal, continuous interchangeability and interaction of these energies. This is almost similar to what's in science called Big Bang. As you know, the Big Bang, initially there was only one kind of energy. Then these energies coalesced and formed galaxies. They formed stars. Then we have Earth. So again, it will be kind of cycling through this. So I can understand that comment, Atman and Brahman, which is part of Hinduism. But to me, what it represents is the interconnectedness and interchangeability of this energy into one form, only to be changed into another form at the end of that particular form's existence.
Thank you, Doctor. As we conclude tonight's discussion, I want to sincerely thank all of you for joining us for what I believe has been a truly fascinating and meaningful conversation. Thank you, Dr. Vivek, for challenging us to think deeper about consciousness, death, meaning, and what it truly means to be human. I also want to thank everyone who tuned in live, submitted questions, and participated in this discussion. Your curiosity and engagement are what make these conversations worthwhile. At Dearborn Blog, at Livonia Salon, our goal has always been to create spaces where serious ideas can still be explored thoughtfully, respectfully, and without fear of difficult questions. Because if we lose the ability to ask profound questions, we eventually lose the ability to understand ourselves. Whether one leaves tonight more skeptical, more spiritual, more curious, or simply more thoughtful, that itself is valuable. Thank you all again for being with us tonight. Good night, stay curious, and never stop searching for truth, wherever it may lead. Dr. Vivek, we hope that we see you again on other programs on Dearborn Blog. Thank you.
Wissam, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much.